In the soft dusk of the American frontier, a boy was born in a small log cabin in Kentucky. His name was Abraham Lincoln, a name that would one day be carved into marble, though his beginnings were as simple as the dirt beneath his feet. In this calm sleep documentary, we slowly follow his life, from quiet childhood evenings by the fire to years of study and hard work, and finally to the heavy responsibility of leading a divided nation. There are no loud battles here, only gentle reflections on sorrow, courage, and the quiet strength that shaped his choices. As you listen, allow your body to relax and your thoughts to drift. Let Lincoln's story become a soft background, guiding you toward rest. If you enjoy this kind of peaceful history for sleep, you can support our journey by liking the video and subscribing, so these stories can continue to accompany your nights. The story begins in the brutal winter of 1809, at a place called Sinking Spring Farm. The world outside was a punishing expanse of gray skies and frozen timber, indifferent to the birth of a child who would one day hold the fate of a republic in his calloused hands. This was not the world of grand estates or silver spoons, but a world where existence was bought with sweat and the sharp edge of an axe. The wilderness of Kentucky was a living, breathing entity, a silent witness to the struggle of the Lincoln family. The cabin itself was a singular room, a fortress of rough-hewn logs meant to keep out the prowling wolves and the creeping frost that sought to reclaim the land. Inside, there was only the flickering orange glow of a modest hearth and the heavy silence of the frontier. Here, the foundation of a giant was laid in the most modest of soils. To understand the president, one must first understand the boy who sat by that fire, absorbing the world through the few books he could find while the rest of the world slept in the darkness. He was a child of the forest, a soul forged in the isolation of the frontier, where every breath was a testament to endurance and every day was a lesson in the fragility of life. This was the crucible that shaped his iron will and his profound empathy for the common man. As the wind howled through the chinks in the logs, the destiny of a man and a nation began to intertwine in the most unlikely of places. We must ask ourselves, what did he see in those flames? Did he glimpse the fire of a burning nation or the light of a new era of liberty? The answers lie deep within the Kentucky woods, waiting to be rediscovered by those who seek the truth. The child was named Abraham, a name that carried the weight of ancient patriarchs. Yet he was born to a man who could barely write his own name, and a woman whose strength was the only shield against the harshness of the wild. Thomas and Nancy Lincoln provided the love and the rugged structure that would support a boy whose mind was already stretching far beyond the limits of the forest. The dirt floor of that cabin was his first stage, and the silence of the trees was his first audience. He learned early that nature does not give gifts. It only offers challenges that must be overcome through patience and labor. This perspective would later serve as the bedrock of his political philosophy. Every log he helped split and every mile he walked through the snow was a stitch in the fabric of a character that would not yield to the pressure of a civil war. This was the beginning of the American dream in its purest and most challenging form, a testament to the idea that greatness is not inherited but forged in the fires of necessity and quiet contemplation. The cabin at Sinking Spring was less a home in the modern sense and more a primal shelter against the relentless elements. It stood small and defiant against the towering canopy of ancient trees that seemed to reach towards the heavens and swallow the light before it could touch the ground. The air inside this tiny fortress was permanently thick with the acrid smell of burning hickory wood and the distinct, damp scent of the earth that formed their floor, a scent that would linger in Abraham's olfactory memory long after he had left the wilderness far behind. There were no glass windows in this first home, only an opening crudely draped with stiff animal skins, which barely served to keep out the prowling beasts and let in slivers of the biting cold that defined the brutal Kentucky winter. His first view of the world was not one of broad horizons or rolling hills, but of rough, dark logs chinked with mud to seal out the drafts, and the shadowy corners where the weak firelight could not fully reach. It was a confined world defined entirely by necessity, where every single object possessed a vital purpose for survival. The heavy iron pot hanging precariously over the fire, the thick handmade quilt stitched by his mother's patient hands, the long rifle leaning ready in the corner. These objects were the totem poles of his infancy. The rhythm of his very existence was set not by clocks, but by the rising and setting of the sun, and the deep, pervading silence of the endless forest that surrounded them on all sides. This silence was not empty or peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with the unspoken struggles and constant anxieties of pioneer life. It was a silence that demanded one be constantly alert. In this profound isolation, far from villages or schools, a deep resilience began to take root in the young boy's soul. The wilderness does not coddle its inhabitants. It demands strength and punishes weakness without mercy. Young Abraham began to absorb this harsh reality long before he had the words to articulate it. He learned to listen to the subtle shifts in the wind that heralded a storm, to read the signs of the changing seasons in the behavior of the animals, and to understand the quiet, stoic fortitude of his parents. Thomas Lincoln was a man of unyielding physical labor, stern in countenance and often silent, his massive hands shaped by the handle of the axe and the guidance of the plow. Nancy Hanks was the gentle counterpoint to this roughness, possessing a deep reservoir of spiritual strength and a love for mystic stories that she whispered to her son in the dim candlelight. Together, in that tiny space, they forged a protective, necessary circle around their son in an unforgiving landscape. This was a life stripped utterly bare of pretense or artifice. There was absolutely no room for vanity or ego in a one-room cabin where the mere act of survival was a daily, exhausting concern. It was here, crawling on that packed dirt floor, playing with simple toys fashioned from corn husks and listening to the hypnotic crackle of the fire as winter winds howled outside, that Lincoln developed his fundamental, unshakable understanding of the human condition. He saw life in its most elemental form, raw and unfiltered. The poverty they experienced was real and crushing, but so was the inherent dignity of hard labor and the absolute necessity of relying on one's immediate family. The seeds of his profound future empathy for the enslaved, the oppressed, and the forgotten were sown deep in this very soil, where he learned at his most impressionable age what it truly meant to have little in this world, but the strength of one's own spirit and the warmth of a meager fire. The migration of the Lincoln family deeper into the American interior, crossing the treacherous waters of the Ohio River and venturing into the dense, unbroken wilderness of southern Indiana, marked a fundamental shift from mere survival to a relentless, multi-year war against the forest itself. Here, in this vast and cathedral-like expanse of ancient timber, the trees stood like emerald sentinels, massive oaks, walnuts, and hickories that formed a canopy so thick it often choked out the midday sun and left the forest floor in a state of perpetual twilight. In this new, imposing world, the axe ceased to be just a tool. It became an extension of young Abraham's growing body, the primary instrument through which his existence was defined and his destiny was carved, chip by agonizing chip. From the moment his long, slender hands were large enough to grip the smooth and heavy hickory handle, the rhythm of his life was set by the swing and strike of steel against stubborn timber. It was grueling, repetitive labor stripped of all romance and mirth. Day after day, from the first gray light of dawn piercing the morning mist until the shadows of twilight stretched long and distorted across the small clearing. He swung the heavy blade with a precision that grew more deadly with every season. The sheer volume of wood required just to keep the hearth fed against the brutal, bone-chilling Midwestern winters was staggering, let alone the timber needed for thousands of split-rail fences, temporary shelters, and the eventual expansion of their modest farm. This was the crucible that transformed the gangly, awkward boy into a man of legendary physical prowess. His shoulders thickened with layers of hard-earned muscle. His forearms became corded with thick veins and sinew like the roots of the trees he felled, and his hands hardened into thick leather, capable of feats of strength that would eventually become the legendary stuff of frontier folklore and campfire stories. Yet, in the monotonous, hypnotic thwack of the axe echoing through the silent and indifferent woods, there was a strange and powerful form of meditation that allowed his mind to escape the physical pain. The solitude of the work was absolute and nearly suffocating. For hours on end, his only companions were the towering trees he was tasked to bring down, and the salt of the sweat stinging his eyes in the summer heat, or the frostbite nipping at his fingertips in the winter. In this profound silence, while his body performed the mechanical and exhausting motions of labor, his mind was free to wander far beyond the confines of the dusty clearing. He learned the immense and quiet patience required to bring down a mighty oak, knowing with a deep certainty that it could not be done in a single furious blow, but only through thousands of calculated, persistent, and rhythmic strikes. This was a visceral lesson in strategy and long-term endurance that would serve him long after he finally set down the heavy axe. He was not merely splitting firewood in those lonely and forgotten glades. He was forging the physical and mental vessel that would one day need to carry the crushing weight of a fractured and bleeding nation without breaking under the pressure. The discipline of the axe became the discipline of his soul, teaching him that even the most formidable obstacles can be dismantled if one has the stamina to strike again and again until the task is complete. As he stood alone in the heart of the Indiana forest, he was a silhouette of raw potential against a background of ancient nature. Each tree that fell was not just land cleared, but a barrier removed from his path toward the future. The physical strength he built here was not for vanity but for utility, a foundation of power that gave him the confidence to face any storm. He learned the language of the woods, the way the grain of the wood resisted the blade, the way the wind whispered warnings through the upper branches, and the way the earth felt under his bare feet as he braced for the next swing. This intimate connection with the land and the hard realities of labor gave him a unique perspective on the human condition. He saw that life was a series of hard-won victories over an indifferent environment, and that the only true path to freedom and progress was through the unwavering application of one's own will and labor. The young Lincoln was a man of the earth long before he was a man of the state. The year 1818 brought a shadow over the Indiana clearing that no amount of firelight could ever truly dispel. A mysterious and deadly illness known as the milk sickness began to creep through the isolated pioneer settlements, leaving a trail of silent cabins and fresh graves in its wake. This silent killer, born from the white snakeroot plant consumed by cattle, showed no mercy to the strong or the young. Among its victims was the very heart and soul of the Lincoln home, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. She was a woman of delicate spirit and profound inner strength, the one who had whispered the first words of wisdom and mystery into Abraham's receptive ear. As she lay on her meager bed of corn husks in the dim light of the cabin, the 9-year-old boy watched the life and light slowly fade from her eyes. It was a moment that would forever tint his world with a shade of enduring melancholy, a sadness that would become a permanent companion throughout his journey to greatness. The loss was not merely emotional. In the harsh reality of the frontier, it was a catastrophic blow to the family's foundation. With the passing of Nancy, the warmth seemed to drain out of the log walls, leaving Abraham and his sister Sarah in a cold and hollow world. But even in the depths of his grief, the demands of survival did not pause for a child's tears. In a testament to the brutal stoicism of the era, Abraham was called upon to assist his father in the most grim of tasks. He helped fashion the very coffin that would hold his mother's earthly remains, the rhythmic sound of the hammer and the rasp of the saw serving as a haunting requiem for the woman who had given him life. They buried her on a lonely, wooded knoll near the cabin, without a minister or a formal ceremony, leaving only a simple mound of earth under the towering trees. This first encounter with death at such an impressionable age carved a deep valley in Lincoln's psyche. He became a man of sorrows long before he became a man of the people. The silence of the forest now felt different to him. It was no longer just a backdrop for labor, but a vast, echoing chamber of loss. He would often return to that grave, sitting in the indigo shadows of the evening, seeking a connection with the mother who had encouraged his curiosity and his hunger for a life beyond the trees. It was here that his profound empathy began to mature, a recognition that every soul carries a heavy burden, and that kindness is the only true light in a dark world. The memory of Nancy Hanks became a sacred flame within him, a guiding star that reminded him of the fragility of existence and the absolute necessity of being a man of character and compassion. He learned that even the strongest hearts can be broken, and that true leadership is born from the ability to walk through the fire of grief and emerge with a heart that beats for the suffering of others. This was the silent turning point where the boy of the woods began to develop the soul of a savior. In the profound and often suffocating darkness of the Indiana nights, where the only sound was the occasional pop of a drying log and the distant, lonely howl of a wolf, a different kind of fire began to burn within the young Abraham Lincoln. While his body was being relentlessly forged by the physical demands of the frontier, his mind was starving for something the wilderness could not easily provide: knowledge. In a world where books were rarer than gold and formal schooling was a luxury beyond reach, he became his own teacher, his own mentor, and his own guide through the vast landscape of human thought. The flickering, unstable orange glow of the fireplace became his sanctuary, a small circle of light where the boundary between a farm boy and a future statesman began to blur. He would crouch for hours on the hard dirt floor, his long shadow dancing against the rough Kuduk walls, eyes straining to devour every precious word of the few volumes he managed to get his hands on. Paper was an unimaginable luxury in that one-room cabin, so he turned the very tools of his labor into the instruments of his education. He would take a piece of charred wood from the hearth and use it as a makeshift pencil, transforming the flat surface of a wooden shovel into a slate where he practiced his ciphers and refined his compositions. When the shovel was covered in charcoal markings, he would shave it clean with his knife and begin again, a cycle of learning that mirrored the repetitive stroke of his axe. This was not merely studying. It was a desperate, spiritual quest to understand a world that existed far beyond the towering canopy of the Indiana forest. He read Aesop's fables until the lessons of the animals became part of his own moral fabric. He immersed himself in the King James Bible, absorbing the majestic rhythms of the prose and the deep, ancient wisdom of the parables. He walked 20 miles through the dense brush and mud just to borrow a single book from a distant neighbor, carrying it back as if it were a sacred relic. Every sentence he read was a brick in the foundation of his future eloquence. He did not just read books, he inhabited them, memorizing long passages and reciting them to the trees as he worked in the fields. This was where his legendary mastery of language was born, not in a university hall, but in the silent company of the woods and the dying embers of a frontier fire. He understood early on that knowledge was the ultimate tool of liberation, a way to break the invisible chains of poverty and isolation that held his family in their grip. While the rest of the world saw only a tall, awkward boy with coal-stained hands, the book saw a mind capable of grasping the complexities of law, philosophy, and human nature. His hunger was insatiable, a driving force that pushed him to stay awake long after the rest of the household had surrendered to exhaustion. In those quiet hours, as the frost crept across the windowless openings of the cabin, Lincoln was building a cathedral of the mind, stone by stone, word by word. He was preparing himself for a stage he could not yet imagine, honing the intellect that would one day need to outmaneuver the most brilliant legal and political minds of his generation. The darkness of the frontier was vast, but the light he carried within was becoming inextinguishable. The time eventually arrived when the protective, suffocating cocoon of the deep woods could no longer contain the restless spirit and giant frame of Abraham Lincoln. He had outgrown the limited horizons of his father's farm, both physically and intellectually, and the call of the wider world became a deafening roar that drowned out the familiar sounds of the forest. His path to independence began not on a road, but on the mighty, churning waters of the American river system. The two journeys he undertook aboard flatboats down the Mississippi River to the bustling port of New Orleans were the true universities of his young adulthood. These voyages were his first real immersion into the grand and often brutal tapestry of human existence outside the isolated frontier settlements. Imagine the tall, gangly youth standing at the stern of a clumsy wooden craft, gripping the massive steering oar as the current pulled him further and further from everything he had ever known. The river was a living beast, wide and unpredictable, its muddy waters hiding treacherous snag and shifting sandbars that required constant vigilance. Days stretched into weeks under the immense dome of the sky, the silence broken only by the creak of the timber, the splash of the water, and the occasional call of a river bird. The nights were profound exercises in solitude, steering by the faint light of the stars while the massive shadows of the untamed riverbanks glided past. It was during these long, quiet hours on the water that he had ample time to contemplate his place in this vast new geography. However, the true shock awaited him at the end of the journey. New Orleans was a sensory explosion for a boy raised in the quietude of the wilderness, a chaotic, vibrant metropolis filled with strange languages, exotic smells, and a dizzying array of humanity. Yet, amidst the spectacle of commerce and culture, he witnessed a sight that would sear itself permanently onto his soul and eventually define his life's greatest mission. In the open markets under the hot southern sun, he saw human beings, men, women, and terrified children, being auctioned off like cattle, their dignity stripped away by the cold calculations of the slave trade. The sight of chains on human flesh, the sound of the auctioneer's hammer, and the palpable despair in the eyes of the enslaved were images that never left him. It is said that upon seeing this abomination, a deep melancholy settled over him, and he vowed internally that if he ever got the chance to strike that institution, he would strike it hard. Returning north, a changed man with a broader and darker perspective on the world, he eventually settled in the small, burgeoning village of New Salem, Illinois. This was the place where he truly began to carve out an identity separate from his family. It was a rough-and-tumble frontier town perched on a bluff overlooking the Sangamon River, a place alive with ambition, politics, and the raw energy of a growing nation. Here, the young giant with the high-pitched voice and the endless supply of stories began to find his footing. He took on varied roles that exposed him to every facet of the community, working behind the counter of a general store, where he became famous for his honesty and his love of debate, serving as the village postmaster, where he voraciously read the newspapers before delivering them, and teaching himself the intricate art of surveying. He was still raw, often awkward in social settings, and deeply insecure about his lack of formal education. Yet his intellect and his inherent decency began to draw people to him like moths to a flame. New Salem was the laboratory where he tested his voice, honed his storytelling skills in the Cracker Barrel discussions at the store, and took his very first, tentative steps into the complex arena of local politics. The transition from the physical world of the axe and the river to the abstract and towering world of the law was not a sudden leap for Abraham Lincoln, but a slow, deliberate immersion into the very soul of human society and order. In the quiet village of New Salem, while the rest of the community surrendered to the heavy exhaustion of their daily labors and the darkness of the night, a different kind of vigil was being kept in the dim corner of a general store. It began with a chance discovery that felt like an act of divine providence, a barrel of discarded items purchased to help a traveler in need that contained a treasure far more valuable than any gold to a mind like Lincoln's, a complete set of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. As he pulled those dusty, leather-bound volumes from the bottom of the barrel, he felt the immense weight of centuries of human wisdom pressing against his calloused palms. The scent of old paper, decaying leather, and the faint musk of time became the new perfume of his nights. He would lie for hours on his back in the tall grass during the day, his long legs propped against the trunk of a shady oak, or huddle near the dying embers of the fireplace at night, oblivious to the world around him. The law was not merely a set of rules to him. It was a grand architectural structure designed to protect the weak from the strong and to bring order to the chaotic impulses of humanity. As he turned the fragile pages, the flickering candle light cast long, dancing shadows against the rough wooden walls of his sanctuary, mirroring the complex ideas that were beginning to take shape in his mind. He was a man who had seen the raw injustice of the slave markets in New Orleans and the unpredictable cruelty of nature on the frontier. And in these books, he found the tools to build a shield for the common man. Every legal principle he absorbed was a new weapon in his intellectual arsenal, a way to fight for truth without needing the blunt force of a physical blade. The study was agonizingly slow and profoundly solitary. Without a teacher to guide him or a peer to discuss the nuances of the text, Lincoln had to rely entirely on his own unyielding focus and the deep reservoir of patience he had developed in the Indiana woods. He would read a single paragraph over and over until the logic of it was etched into his brain like the grain of a well-worn hickory handle. He was teaching himself the language of power, the precise, measured words that could move juries, sway judges, and eventually alter the course of a nation's history. The neighbors in New Salem would often pass by and see the tall giant lost in his books, sometimes even walking down the road while reading aloud to himself to hear the rhythm and weight of the legal prose. They saw a man who was physically present in their world but whose spirit was wandering through the courtrooms of London and the halls of ancient justice. This period of self-study was the bridge between his past as a laborer and his future as a leader. He began to understand that words, when chosen with care and backed by moral courage, were the most powerful force in existence. He was not just learning the law to earn a living. He was seeking a way to give voice to the voiceless and to find a higher purpose for his own restless soul. In the silence of those New Salem nights, as the moon moved slowly across the sky and the frost patterns formed on the window panes, Lincoln was slowly dismantling the barriers of his own humble origin. He was preparing for a journey into the heart of the American legal system, where his honesty and his ability to see the human story behind every dry legal statute would become his greatest strengths. The dusty books were his ladder, and he was climbing out of the darkness of the frontier into the bright and challenging light of public service. The vast, rolling prairies of Illinois became the new stage for Abraham Lincoln's expanding life, a landscape defined by endless horizons and the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves against the sun-baked earth. As he was finally admitted to the bar and began his practice as a circuit-riding lawyer, he entered a world of dusty roads, rustic courthouses, and a kaleidoscope of human nature in its most raw and unvarnished form. The 8th Judicial Circuit was a sprawling territory that required him to travel hundreds of miles every year, often in the solitude of a simple buggy or on the back of a reliable horse named Old Buck. These long journeys across the open grasslands were a continuation of his education, offering him deep silence and solitude to contemplate the complex legal cases that awaited him in the next town. His saddlebags were always heavy, not with wealth, but with the weight of law books, legal papers, and a few precious volumes of poetry or history that served as his intellectual companions under the immense Midwestern sky. The frontier courthouses were far from the grand marble halls of justice he would later inhabit. They were often cramped, drafty wooden buildings where the air was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco, wet wool, and the palpable tension of local disputes. In these humble settings, Lincoln's legendary reputation began to take shape, not through flashy oratory or legal trickery, but through a profound and unshakable integrity that the common people could sense instinctively. He was a man who preferred to settle disputes with a story and a handshake rather than a protracted legal battle. He was known to discourage clients from pursuing cases he believed were unjust, even if it meant foregoing a much-needed fee. This was the crucible where Honest Abe was born, a title earned not in the halls of power, but in the small-town squares and around the tavern fires where he shared his wit and wisdom with farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants. He spoke the language of the people because he was one of them, his voice carrying the resonance of the forest and the clarity of a mountain stream. His legal style was as unique as his physical appearance. He had a remarkable ability to strip away the complex jargon of the law and reveal the simple, human truth at the heart of every matter. In the courtroom, his tall, gangly frame seemed to command the space, his deep-set eyes conveying a sense of profound sadness and undeniable truth. He would often use his sharp wit and his bottomless well of stories to disarm his opponents and win over skeptical juries. Yet, behind the humor and the storytelling was a mind of razor-sharp logic and a heart deeply committed to the principles of fairness and equity. He saw the law as a sacred instrument of democracy, a way to ensure that even the poorest citizen had a voice against the powerful. During those lonely nights in crowded taverns where lawyers and judges slept 3 to a bed, Lincoln would often sit by the fire long after the others had retired, his face illuminated by the dying embers as he studied his briefs and refined his arguments. He was honing the skills that would one day allow him to argue for the soul of a nation. The Illinois roads were his training ground, and every mile he traveled was a step toward a destiny that would require every ounce of the integrity he was forging in the dusty heart of the prairie. The year 1837 marked a definitive turning point in the trajectory of Abraham Lincoln's life, a moment when the solitary figure of the circuit-riding lawyer stepped out of the vast silence of the prairie and into the noisy, chaotic heart of Illinois' burgeoning political landscape. Springfield had just been named the new state capital, a designation largely achieved through the political maneuvering of Lincoln and his colleagues in the legislature known as the Long Nine. It was a town literally rising from the mud, a place where unpainted wooden frame buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with ambitious brick structures that promised a grander future. The streets were infamous seas of deep, sticky mud that could swallow a wagon wheel whole, a fitting metaphor for the messy, often treacherous world of frontier politics that Lincoln was now entering with both feet. He arrived in this raw, bustling center of ambition not as a conquering hero, but in his usual humble manner, riding a borrowed horse and carrying everything he owned in 2 saddlebags. He was 28 years old, tall, awkwardly built, and perpetually plagued by self-doubt and a deep-seated melancholy that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. Yet, beneath that rough, homespun exterior burned an intense and calculating ambition that few truly understood. He settled into a room above the law office of his new partner, John T. Stewart, sleeping on a borrowed bed and immediately immersing himself in the intellectual and social ferment of the new capital. Springfield was a crucible where the future leaders of the state, and eventually the nation, were being forged. It was here, in the smoky backrooms of taverns, in the crowded law offices, and in the lively debates of the Lyceum, that Lincoln began to refine his political philosophy. He was no longer just a local storyteller from New Salem. He was becoming a serious student of statecraft, eagerly devouring newspapers from across the country to understand the great national issues of the day: tariffs, internal improvements, and the ever-present, ominous specter of slavery. His political awakening was not sudden flash of lightning, but a slow, deliberate burning of coals. He learned the intricate dance of legislative procedure, the art of building coalitions among men with wildly different interests, and the necessity of compromise in a democratic system. He was a Whig in a state often dominated by Democrats, a position that required constant strategic thinking and persuasive power. While he was known for his humor and his ability to connect with the common man, his colleagues in Springfield began to see another side of him, a man of profound seriousness, capable of intense concentration and a rigid adherence to principle when it truly mattered. The shift from the physical labor of his youth to the mental labor of law and politics was now complete. The axe had been permanently replaced by the pen and the podium. In the gaslight of Springfield, surrounded by ambitious rivals and complex challenges, the contours of the future statesman were beginning to emerge from the rough clay of the frontier lawyer. He was learning that law was the tool, but politics was the arena where the fate of millions would ultimately be decided. The silence of the woods was far behind him now. He was standing in the center of the gathering storm. In the burgeoning social circles of Springfield, where ambition and pedigree often dictated one's standing, the arrival of Mary Todd in 1839 was akin to a comet streaking across a relatively sedate night sky. She was a force of nature wrapped in the finest silks and crinolines Kentucky high society could produce. Educated, vivacious, intensely political, and possessing a volatile temperament that could shift from charming gaiety to thunderous fury in a heartbeat, she was everything Abraham Lincoln was not. He was tall, angular, often lost in brooding silence, and painfully aware of his humble, rough-hewn origins. She was short, plump, radiating a frantic energy, and fiercely proud of her aristocratic lineage. Yet, across the crowded parlors of the Edwards mansion, where the social elite gathered under the soft glow of oil lamps, a gravitational pull drew these two seemingly incompatible souls together. It was an attraction of opposites, a collision of a deeply melancholic, slow-moving river with a rapidly churning, unpredictable mountain stream. Their courtship was far from a gentle pastoral romance. It was a turbulent drama filled with passionate misunderstandings, broken promises, and profound emotional crises that nearly destroyed them both before they even reached the altar. The most prominent scar on their shared history was the infamous fatal 1st of January. In 1841, the day their engagement was abruptly broken off, plunging Lincoln into a depression so deep and paralyzing that his friends feared for his sanity, removing razors and knives from his reach lest he harm himself in the depths of his despair. For nearly 2 years, they existed in separate orbits, haunted by the ghost of what might have been, until a mutual friend secretly arranged a reconciliation in a quiet parlor. On a rainy, dreary November afternoon in 1842, in a hastily arranged ceremony that lacked the pomp Mary had always dreamed of, they exchanged vows. On a ring he gave her, the inscription read, "Love is eternal." It was a promise that would be tested by fire, sorrow, and the supreme pressures of history. Their early married life began humbly in a single room at the Globe Tavern in Springfield, a cramped existence where the cries of their firstborn son, Robert Todd Lincoln, soon mingled with the sounds of a busy inn. Eventually, they purchased the now famous house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets, the only home Lincoln would ever own. It was here, within those beige walls, that the complex tapestry of their domestic life was woven. It was a partnership fueled by mutual ambition. Mary believed in Abraham's destiny perhaps even more fervently than he did himself, pushing him when he hesitated, smoothing his rough social edges, and using her sharp political instincts to advance his career. Yet, it was also a home marked by intense strain. Lincoln's long absences on the judicial circuit left Mary alone for weeks at a time to manage a growing household and wrangle their rambunctious sons, feeding her inherent insecurities and anxieties. His deep, impenetrable silences often clashed with her need for constant engagement and validation. The sounds emanating from that house were a mixture of genuine affection, intellectual debate, political scheming, and sometimes the sharp tones of marital discord. It was an imperfect union, forged in the realities of human frailty, yet it was the crucible in which Lincoln matured as a man. The domestic storms he weathered at 8th and Jackson were a training ground for the infinitely greater national storm that was slowly gathering on the horizon. In Mary, he found both his greatest champion and his most intimate challenge, a companion who ensured that his life would never be one of peaceful stagnation. Abraham Lincoln walked through the world as a man perpetually followed by a long, dark shadow that no amount of political success or public acclaim could ever truly dispel. This shadow was not cast by the sun or the flickering gaslights of Springfield, but by a profound and heavy melancholy that seemed to reside in the very marrow of his bones and the deepest recesses of his soul. His friends and colleagues often spoke with hushed voices of the hypochondriasis that plagued him, a crushing, nearly paralyzing weight of sadness that could descend upon him without warning and linger for weeks like a thick, impenetrable gray fog over the vast Illinois prairie. There were countless nights in Springfield when the residents would see his tall, thin, slightly stooped silhouette pacing the wooden sidewalks long after the lights in every other house had been extinguished. He was a restless ghost in a black frock coat, seeking some form of solace or perhaps just a momentary escape from his own thoughts in the cold silence of the midnight air. His face was a living map of this internal struggle, etched with deep, permanent lines of care that seemed to tell the story of 1,000 years of human suffering. His eyes, set deep beneath a heavy and prominent brow, were often described by those who knew him as the saddest eyes ever seen in a human countenance. They were eyes that had looked into the abyss of personal loss, the death of his mother, the passing of his sister, and the tragic end of his early love, Anne Rutledge. These experiences had woven a thread of sorrow into the very fabric of his being. Yet this black dog of depression was not merely a burden, it was the crucible of his character. It was through the navigation of his own internal darkness that he developed a bottomless well of empathy for the suffering of others. He understood the pain of the oppressed and the despair of the forgotten, because he carried a version of that same pain within himself every single day of his adult life. He often sought refuge from his mental tempests in the structured beauty of poetry and the rhythmic cadence of the written word. His favorite poem, William Knox's "Oh, Why Should the Spirit of Mortal Be Proud?" became a solemn mantra for his weary soul. He would recite its verses to himself while riding the judicial circuit or sitting alone by a dying fire, finding comfort in the poem's stark reminder of the equality of all human beings in the face of inevitable death and decay. This realization did not make him bitter. Instead, it infused him with a profound sense of humility and a conviction that every human life, no matter how humble, possessed an inherent and sacred dignity. The Man in Black was not just a description of his physical attire, which he wore with a certain disregard for fashion, but a reflection of the mantle of sorrow he felt he was destined to carry for a nation that was slowly tearing itself apart. In the quiet moments of reflection, away from the noise of the courtroom and the political arena, Lincoln wrestled with the ultimate questions of existence and the mysterious hand of Providence. He was a man of deep spiritual searching who did not fit easily into any organized creed, yet he possessed a faith that was forged in the fire of his own struggles. He saw the world as a place of immense beauty and immense tragedy, and he believed that his own suffering was somehow preparation for a task he could not yet fully see. His melancholy gave him a perspective that more cheerful men lacked, a sense of the tragic dimensions of history and the heavy responsibility of those who lead. As he paced those dark Springfield streets, with the wind whispering through the trees and the stars cold and distant above, he was learning to endure the unendurable. He was building the mental and emotional fortitude that would one day allow him to stand firm when the entire world seemed to be crumbling around him. The internal battle was his training ground for the external war to come. He was becoming a vessel for the sorrows of an entire people. As the 19th century marched inexorably past its midpoint, a profound and unsettling silence began to give way to a terrifying rumble beneath the foundations of the American Republic. The issue of slavery, once treated by many politicians as a regrettable but manageable inheritance, began to metastasize into a malignant moral crisis that threatened to consume the entire nation. For Abraham Lincoln, watching from his law office in Springfield as the political landscape around him fractured and dissolved, this was not merely a question of economic policy or constitutional interpretation. It was a deep, agonizing spiritual wound that struck at the very core of his being and his understanding of human liberty. The memory of the chained men and women in the New Orleans marketplace had never faded from his mind. It had only grown sharper, more vivid, and more accusing with each passing year. He saw the institution not just as a political problem to be solved with compromise, but as a monstrous injustice that denied the fundamental truth laid down in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. The decade of the 1850s brought with it a series of legislative thunderclaps that shattered the fragile peace between the North and the South, forcing men like Lincoln to abandon the relative safety of private life and step back into the gladiatorial arena of public debate. The repeal of old compromises that had kept the precarious balance began to open vast new territories to the possibility of slavery's expansion, a prospect that filled Lincoln with a profound dread. He saw a future where the blight of bondage would spread unchecked across the continent, extinguishing the light of freedom that America was meant to represent to the world. This realization woke something dormant and powerful within the Prairie lawyer. His speeches began to change, The folksy humor and lawyerly logic gave way to a deeper, darker, and more prophetic tone. He began to speak with the moral urgency of an Old Testament prophet, warning his countrymen that a house divided against itself could not stand. He argued with immense and sorrowful conviction that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. This internal struggle took a visible toll on the man. His periods of melancholy deepened. His long nocturnal walks became more frequent, and the lines on his face seemed to carve themselves deeper into his leathery skin. He wrestled with the immense complexity of the issue, acknowledging the constitutional protections that slavery sadly enjoyed while simultaneously condemning its moral repugnance. He was not yet an abolitionist in the radical sense. He feared the chaos of immediate emancipation almost as much as he hated slavery itself. But he was driven by an unshakable belief that the institution must be placed on a course of ultimate extinction for the soul of the nation to be saved. In quiet rooms filled with tobacco smoke and the murmurs of worried men, and on drafty wooden platforms under the vast canopy of the prairie sky, Lincoln began to articulate the arguments that would define the coming conflict. He was no longer just arguing cases. He was arguing for the very meaning of America. The weight of history was settling upon his stooped shoulders, and in the deepening gloom of the pre-war years, he began to see that the path ahead would be paved not with compromise and peace, but with blood and fire. The breaking point was no longer a distant possibility. It was an imminent reality, and Lincoln found himself standing directly in its path, a reluctant but determined guardian of a fragile union. The late summer of 1858 brought a heat to the Illinois prairies that was not merely atmospheric but deeply political and spiritual. As two giants of the American political landscape prepared to engage in a series of 7 epic debates that would define the moral boundaries of the nation. On one side stood Stephen A. Douglas, known as the Little Giant, a man of immense oratorical polish, wealth, and established power who represented the pragmatic and often cold calculations of popular sovereignty. On the other side stood Abraham Lincoln, the tall sucker, a man whose rugged appearance and high-pitched voice belied a mind of razor-sharp logic and a soul increasingly burdened by the ethical nightmare of slavery's expansion. These were not merely political speeches. They were a grand, public exorcism of the nation's deepest fears and contradictions, held on makeshift wooden platforms under the vast, indigo sky of a country on the brink of dissolution. Thousands of people traveled for days by wagon and on foot to witness this intellectual gladiatorial contest, standing for hours in the dust and heat to hear the future of their republic debated with a ferocity and clarity never seen before. Lincoln's approach to these debates was a masterpiece of measured rhetoric and moral courage. He stripped away the polished evasions of his opponent and forced the audience to look directly into the hollow heart of the institution of slavery. While Douglas argued for the right of local communities to choose their own destiny regardless of the moral cost, Lincoln argued for a higher law, a universal principle of human rights that transcended state lines and political compromises. He spoke with the quiet intensity of a man who knew that the very foundations of the American experiment were at stake. Every point he made was a rhythmic strike against the logic of oppression, his long arms gesturing toward the horizon as if calling upon the ghosts of the founding fathers to witness his defense of their ideals. The physical contrast between the two men was a visual metaphor for the conflict itself, the polished, stout Douglas representing the established order, and the tall, thin, slightly stooped Lincoln representing the growing, uncomfortable truth that the nation could no longer ignore. As the debates moved from town to town, Ottawa, Freeport, Jonesboro, Charleston, Galesburg, Quincy, and Alton, The name of Abraham Lincoln began to resonate far beyond the borders of Illinois. Through the reports of the new telegraph wires and the pages of the national newspapers, his words were carried to the drawing rooms of New York and the law offices of Boston. He was no longer just a Prairie lawyer. He was becoming the voice of a new and determined conscience. He articulated the famous House divided doctrine with such sorrowful conviction that it echoed in the hearts of millions. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He did not win the Senate seat that year due to the legislative maneuvers of the time, but he won something far more valuable and dangerous: the recognition of a nation and the undying enmity of those who wish to keep the chains of the past firmly in place. The debates were his true baptism in the fire of national politics, a trial that sharpened his intellect and steeled his resolve for the infinitely greater struggle that lay ahead. In the flickering light of the torches at these outdoor gatherings, the silhouette of Lincoln became a symbol of hope for some and a warning for others. He had found his voice, and through that voice, the soul of the nation was beginning to find its own way through the gathering darkness. The road to the presidency was now visible through the dust of the Illinois prairie. The year 1860 arrived like a heavy, suffocating fog that draped itself over the entire American continent, thick with the unspoken fears and the silent screams of a nation drifting slowly toward a precipice from which there might be no return. For Abraham Lincoln, the quiet streets of Springfield had become a sanctuary of agonizing anticipation as the political machinery of a fractured republic began to turn with a terrifying momentum. The Republican National Convention in Chicago, held in a massive wooden structure known as the Wigwam, became the unlikely stage where the rail splitter from the Prairie would be catapulted into the center of a gathering storm. He was not the favorite. He was the dark horse, the man from the West whose humble origin was seen by some as a weakness, and by others as the only hope to bridge the widening chasm between the warring factions of the North. Yet, as the telegrams flashed across the wires with the speed of lightning, the name of Lincoln rose above the din of ambitious rivals, a testament to the quiet power he had built through years of integrity and intellectual labor. Election night in Springfield was a profound exercise in solitary endurance and silent reflection for the man who would soon bear the weight of millions. While the town outside erupted in the nervous energy of torchlight parades and the distant echoes of brass bands, Lincoln retreated to the small, crowded telegraph office, his tall silhouette illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a single oil lamp. He sat for hours in the heavy silence, the rhythmic clicking of the telegraph key serving as a countdown to a destiny he had both sought and dreaded. Each message that arrived confirmed the inevitable. The nation had chosen him, not just as a leader, but as a vessel for its collective hopes and its terrifying uncertainties. When the final result was certain, he walked home through the dark, muddy streets alone, his shadow stretching long and thin against the wooden fences, feeling the mantle of authority settling upon his stooped shoulders like a cloak of lead. The cheers of his neighbors felt distant, muffled by the immense gravity of the task that lay ahead. The silence that followed his victory was perhaps the most ominous of all. From the south, there came not a roar of protest, but a cold, calculated withdrawal, a silence that spoke of secession and the unraveling of the American experiment. Lincoln sat in his modest home at 8th and Jackson, surrounded by the familiar objects of his private life, knowing that his days as a simple attorney and a Prairie neighbor were over forever. He was now the president-elect of a house divided against itself, a man tasked with holding together a structure that was already beginning to splinter under the pressure of hatred and fear. He spent those months in Springfield in a state of deep, prayerful contemplation, refining his thoughts for the journey to Washington, and preparing his soul for a trial that would require more than just legal skill or political wisdom. He was becoming a man of history, a figure of tragic dimensions whose every decision would soon be measured in the blood of his countrymen. The silence in the White House was waiting for him, a silence that he would soon fill with the words of a prophet and the actions of a savior. The rail splitter was gone. The president was being born in the quiet of the Illinois night. The journey from Springfield to Washington, D.C. was not a triumphal procession, but a perilous odyssey through a nation that was already tearing itself apart at the seams. Abraham Lincoln, the president-elect, traveled under a cloak of secrecy and constant threat, changing trains in the dead of night and disguising his towering frame with a soft felt hat and an old shawl to avoid the assassins who were rumored to be lurking in every shadowed corner of Baltimore. The capital city he finally entered was a physical manifestation of the fractured republic itself, a sprawling, muddy encampment dominated by the half-finished dome of the Capitol building, its iron ribs exposed to the sky like the skeletal remains of a great beast, waiting for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The air was thick with the scent of impending war, political intrigue, and the palpable fear of the residents who watched with bated breath to see if this Prairie lawyer could truly save them. On March 4, 1861, a cold, damp wind whipped around the unfinished east portico of the Capitol, carrying with it the whispers of rebellion and the distant echo of military drums. The atmosphere was charged with a tension so thick it felt as if the very air could shatter like glass at any moment. Sharpshooters were stationed on the rooftops, their rifles trained on the crowd below, and soldiers with fixed bayonets formed a protective ring around the platform where the tall, gaunt man stood, his face a mask of profound sorrow and unshakable resolve. As he stepped forward to place his large hand on the weathered Bible, a profound silence fell over the sea of faces. This was not merely a political ceremony. It was a solemn act of faith in the idea of America itself. He was swearing to protect a constitution that was being actively rejected by 7 states, and he was becoming the commander-in-chief of an army that was hemorrhaging its best officers to the newly formed Confederacy. His inaugural address was a masterpiece of carefully crafted rhetoric, a final, desperate plea for peace delivered with the authority of a father speaking to wayward children. He spoke not with anger, but with a deep and abiding sadness, appealing to the better angels of our nature, and reminding his countrymen of the mystical cords of memory that bound them together. Every word was chosen with the precision of a surgeon, designed to soothe the inflamed passions of the South without compromising the fundamental principles of the Union. He argued with immense moral clarity that the central idea of secession was the essence of anarchy, and that the Union was older than the Constitution itself. Yet, even as his deep voice echoed across the stone and marble, many in the crowd knew in their hearts that the time for words had passed. The silence that followed his final sentence was heavy with the unspoken realization that the sword would soon be drawn. Lincoln walked away from the podium not as a victor, but as a man who had just accepted the most terrible burden ever placed upon an American leader. He had taken the oath, but the true test of his presidency was yet to come. The first breath of his administration was drawn in the suffocating atmosphere of a nation on the brink of fratricide. The spring of 1861 arrived in Washington not with the gentle promise of renewal, but with the heavy, suffocating weight of an impending doom. The cherry blossoms along the tidal basin bloomed in stark, beautiful contrast to the dark storm clouds of war gathering over the southern horizon. In the executive mansion, the new president, Abraham Lincoln, paced the worn carpets of his office deep into the night, his tall, gaunt frame a silhouette against the gaslight, his mind a battlefield of impossible choices. The agonizing wait was finally over. The long-delayed confrontation between the federal government and the seceding states was no longer a theoretical debate in the halls of Congress, but a terrifying reality focused on a small, isolated brick fortress on an island in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson and his small garrison of Union soldiers were running out of supplies, surrounded by a ring of hostile Confederate cannons that pointed directly at their hearts. The fateful moment arrived in the pre-dawn darkness of April 12, 1861, when a single signal mortar shell traced a fiery arc across the inky black sky and exploded above the fort, a terrible, beautiful herald of the carnage to come. This was followed by a deafening, relentless barrage from the circling batteries that lasted for 34 hours. The roar of the cannons was not merely the sound of gunpowder and iron. It was the primal scream of a nation tearing itself apart. It was the terrifying answer to decades of political compromise, moral arguments, and profound human suffering. In Washington, the news traveled over the telegraph wires like an electric shock, shattering the last fragile illusions of peace. For Lincoln, receiving the telegrams in his office, the physical impact of the words was like a blow to the chest. The moment he had dreaded, the moment he had prayed to avoid, had finally arrived. The mystic chords of memory he had so eloquently spoken of in his inaugural address had been snapped by the brute force of artillery. The surrender of the fort the following day was a military inevitability but a political thunderclap. The American flag, stars and stripes tattered and smoke-stained, was lowered in defeat. Yet, in that moment of loss, a fierce clarity emerged from the smoke. The attack on a federal installation was an act of open rebellion that could no longer be ignored or appeased. The waiting was over. The war had begun. Lincoln's response was swift and decisive, a profound shift from the cautious diplomat to the determined commander-in-chief. He issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the insurrection, a number that seemed vast at the time but would soon prove tragically inadequate for the scale of the conflict ahead. This was the crossing of the Rubicon for the American Republic. The silence of the antebellum years was gone forever, replaced by the martial rhythm of drums and the tramp of marching boots. The rail splitter from Illinois now held a sword in his hand, and the weight of the nation's future rested solely on his shoulders as the first great battles began to take shape in the terrible distance. The initial excitement that crackled through the streets of Washington like a sudden summer storm began to curdle into a thick, sour anxiety as the true scale of the task before Abraham Lincoln became apparent. In those first few months of 1861, there was a naive and almost festive atmosphere among the Northern public, a collective delusion that the rebellion could be crushed with a single, decisive stroke, and that the volunteers would be home in time for the harvest. The capital city was a chaotic forest of white tents, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke and the sounds of men practicing drills they did not yet understand. Lincoln, watching from the windows of the executive mansion, saw the raw energy of his people but felt the immense weight of their unpreparedness. He was a man of peace forced to become a student of war overnight, spending his nights hunched over military maps and ancient tactical manuals, seeking a path through a geography he knew only from a lawyer's perspective. The illusion of a short and bloodless war was finally shattered on a sweltering July afternoon near a small stream in Virginia called Bull Run. The first battle of Bull Run was supposed to be a grand spectacle. So confident were the residents of Washington that hundreds of civilians, senators, socialites, and journalists drove their carriages out to the hillsides to watch the conflict as if it were a Sunday picnic. They brought hampers of food and fine wines, expecting a swift and glorious Union victory. But as the smoke from the muskets began to obscure the sun and the first screams of the wounded drifted across the fields, the festive atmosphere vanished. What followed was a terrifying awakening to the industrial scale of modern slaughter. The Union lines, undertrained and overwhelmed by the fierce resistance of the Confederate Stonewall Jackson, finally broke. The retreat turned into a panicked rout, a sea of blue uniforms flowing back toward Washington in a chaotic mass of men, horses, and abandoned picnic baskets. Lincoln spent that entire day and the following night in the telegraph office, his tall silhouette a motionless shadow against the wall as the messages of disaster clicked across the wires. Each word was a new wound to his spirit. He saw the shattered remains of his army streaming back across the long bridge into the city, exhausted, blood-stained, and stripped of their youthful bravado. The silence in the White House that night was not the silence of peace, but the hollow silence of shock and mourning. For the first time, the true face of the monster they had unleashed was visible to everyone. It was not a gentleman's disagreement. It was a war of annihilation. Lincoln did not sleep. He sat in his office as the rain began to fall over the muddy streets of the Capitol, staring into the dying fire. He realized then that the road to victory would be measured not in months, but in years, and not in speeches, but in the lives of hundreds of thousands of his countrymen. This defeat was the true beginning of his transformation. The Prairie lawyer was being burned away in the fire of national catastrophe, leaving behind a leader of steel and sorrow. He did not lash out in anger or seek to shift the blame to his generals. Instead, he absorbed the failure as if it were his own. He began to understand that he would have to become the soul of the resistance, the one who stayed firm when everyone else was ready to surrender to despair. The burden of every life lost at Bull Run settled onto his stooped shoulders, and he accepted it with a grim and holy resolve. The silence of the night was filled with the realization that the American experiment was now being tested in a way it had never been before. The rail splitter was gone forever. In his place stood the commander-in-chief of a broken nation, preparing himself for the long, bloody night of a war that would redefine the meaning of freedom for all time. He began to formulate the strategy that would eventually win the war, even as he mourned the innocents that had died on the banks of that Virginia stream. The winter of 1861-1862 descended upon Washington, D.C. like a shroud of cold, wet iron, transforming the capital into a vast, dismal swamp of mud and misery. The illusion of a quick victory had vanished in the smoke of Bull Run, replaced by a grim realization of the protracted conflict ahead. Abraham Lincoln, now fully bearing the crushing mantle of wartime leadership, found himself fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the rebellious Confederacy in the field, and another against the paralyzing inertia and monumental ego of his own military commander, General George B. McClellan. McClellan, dubbed the young Napoleon by a fawning press, was a master of organization and drill who had miraculously transformed the shattered remnants of the Union forces into the magnificent, disciplined Army of the Potomac. Yet, this gleaming military machine sat idle in its vast encampments around the Capitol, polishing its buttons and parading in the mud while the president begged for action. Lincoln, often wrapping himself in a shawl against the pervasive damp chill, would visit McClellan's headquarters incessantly, only to be met with condescension, excuses, and endless delays. He was a civilian lawyer trying to move a mountain of military arrogance, famously remarking in a moment of profound frustration that if General McClellan did not want to use the army, he would like to borrow it for a while. The silence of the guns was deafening. It was the sound of opportunity slipping away while the nation bled treasure and morale into the freezing Virginia mud. But the true heart of darkness for Abraham Lincoln during that terrible winter was not found in the inaction of his generals, but inside the executive mansion itself. In February 1862, a different kind of shadow crept into the White House, one that no army could defeat. His beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, the bright, serious-minded child who most resembled Lincoln in temperament and intellect, the apple of his eye amid the chaos of war, fell ill with typhoid fever, likely contracted from the polluted Potomac River water that supplied the house. For days, as the political storms raged outside, Lincoln paced the hallways at night, a spectral figure in his nightshirt, keeping vigil by the boy's bedside as the fever burned brighter and brighter. When Willie finally breathed his last on a stormy Thursday, the light seemed to go out of Abraham Lincoln's world forever. He was shattered in a way that few had ever seen. The man who had stoically borne the weight of a fracturing nation collapsed under the weight of a father's grief. He would often shut himself in his room, his racking sobs audible through the thick doors, or wander into the room where Willie's body lay, gazing at the pale face of his lost son with an expression of unspeakable agony. This personal catastrophe occurred right at the moment when the nation needed him most, forcing him to navigate the darkest hours of the war while his own heart was broken into pieces. Mary Todd Lincoln was so undone by the loss that she remained bedridden for weeks, her erratic behavior intensifying into a grief so profound it bordered on madness, leaving Lincoln to mourn largely alone while simultaneously managing the affairs of state. He had to hide his devastation behind a mask of grim determination during cabinet meetings and public appearances, only to let the mask slip in the solitary confinement of his office late at night. It was during these agonizing weeks that the profound melancholy that had always shadowed him deepened into a permanent, geological feature of his character. He became the man of sorrows in the truest sense, a leader who understood the terrible cost of the war not as an abstract statistic, but as a piercing, personal reality. The death of Willie seemed to merge with the deaths of the thousands of soldiers on the battlefield, creating a vast ocean of suffering that threatened to drown him completely. Yet, from this depth of despair, a harder, more resolute Lincoln began to emerge. He had looked into the abyss, and having nothing left to fear, he committed himself with a renewed, almost frightening intensity to the cause of the Union, knowing now that the only way out of the darkness was through the fire. The sweltering summer of 1862 brought a different kind of heat to the shaded rooms of the White House, a fever of the spirit that mirrored the literal fevers ravaging the Union camps. Abraham Lincoln, his face now a permanent mask of exhaustion and indigo-tinged sorrow, realized that the war had reached a terrible impasse that could no longer be solved by military maneuvers alone. The blood spilled at places like Shiloh and the failed campaigns in Virginia had revealed a haunting truth. The Union was fighting a phantom that was being fed and sustained by the very institution it hesitated to touch. Slavery was no longer just a moral stain. It was the engine of the Confederate war effort, the silent labor force that allowed the South to send every white man to the front lines while its fields remained tended and its defenses remained strong. Lincoln understood with a chilling clarity that to save the Union, he would have to strike at the very heart of the rebellion's social and economic structure. He began to contemplate an act so radical, so fraught with political peril, that it threatened to shatter the fragile coalition of border states and conservative Northerners who still held onto the illusion of a war without social revolution. In the quiet hours of those humid Washington nights, as the gaslights flickered low, and the only sound was the scratching of his pen across parchment, Lincoln began to draft the document that would redefine the meaning of the struggle. This was the silent birth of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was not a sudden burst of idealistic fervor, but a slow, calculated realization that justice and military necessity had finally become indistinguishable. He was a lawyer by trade, and he framed the document as a fit and necessary war measure, a legal instrument that would allow the commander-in-chief to seize the property, the human property, of those in rebellion. Yet, behind the dry legal terminology was the beating heart of a man who had seen the chains in New Orleans and had never forgotten their sound. He was preparing to unleash a social earthquake that would forever alter the American landscape, turning the war into a crusade for the fundamental dignity of the human soul. When he first presented the draft to his cabinet in July 1862, the room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. His Secretary of State, William Seward, advised him to wait for a military victory before issuing it, lest the act appear as a last shriek on the retreat of a dying administration. And so, Lincoln waited. He folded the draft and tucked it into his pocket, where it remained for weeks like a hidden ember burning against his heart. The silence of those weeks was agonizing. He watched the casualty lists grow longer and the political pressure mount from both the radical abolitionists who demanded immediate action and the conservatives who feared it. He felt the eyes of the world upon him, the monarchies of Europe waiting for any excuse to recognize the Confederacy, and the enslaved millions waiting for any sign of hope. He walked the darkened halls of the White House late at night, sometimes reciting Shakespeare to the shadows, seeking some form of guidance from the better angels he had once invoked. He understood that if he issued this proclamation and the Union failed, he would be remembered as a tyrant who sparked a racial war. If he succeeded, he would be the savior of a race and the architect of a new birth of freedom. The blue twilight of Washington felt heavier than ever as the nation moved toward a crossroads where the old world would have to die so that a new one could be born. The pen was poised, waiting for the sword to clear a path. September 1862 arrived with a deceptive golden light over the Maryland countryside, a landscape of rolling hills and ripening corn that would soon be transformed into a vast, indigo-shadowed slaughterhouse. General Robert E. Lee had crossed the Potomac, bringing the war to northern soil and forcing a desperate confrontation that would determine the fate of the Emancipation Proclamation still burning in Abraham Lincoln's pocket. The Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg, was not merely a military engagement. It was a titanic struggle for the very soul of the Republic. In the early morning mist of September 17, the air was shattered by the roar of artillery and the rhythmic crackle of musketry as two great armies collided in a space no larger than a few farm fields. The places that would forever be etched in the American memory, the cornfield, the sunken road, the stone bridge, became charnel houses where the blood of thousands ran in deep, dark rivulets through the trampled earth. Lincoln, miles away in Washington, sat in the telegraph office as the names of the fallen began to tick across the wires in a relentless, heartbreaking rhythm. The carnage was beyond anything the nation had ever witnessed. It remains the bloodiest single day in American history. By sunset, over 23,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing. The indigo twilight of that evening descended over a landscape that looked like a vision of hell, where the blue and gray uniforms were equally stained with the red of their shared sacrifice. Yet amidst the horror, a tactical opening emerged. Lee's invasion had been checked, and his battered army began a slow retreat back across the Potomac into Virginia. It was the narrowest of victories, but for Abraham Lincoln, it was the signal he had been waiting for from a higher power. He had made a covenant with God that if the rebels were driven from Maryland, he would issue the proclamation. The sword had finally cleared a path for the pen. On September 22, 5 days after the fields of Antietam had been soaked in blood, Lincoln called his cabinet together for a historic meeting that would change the course of human history. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, with a solemnity that transcended ordinary politics. Lincoln began the meeting by reading a humorous story by Artemus Ward, a brief moment of levity to mask the immense gravity of what he was about to do. Then, his voice deepening and his face set in lines of unshakable resolve, he informed his ministers that the time for hesitation was over. He read the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state, then in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It was a declaration of war against the very foundation of the Southern social order, an act that transformed the Union Army into an army of liberation. The document was not an emotional appeal, but a cold, legalistic decree of military necessity, yet its implications were revolutionary. It ensured that the war could never end with a mere restoration of the old Union. It was now a struggle for a new birth of freedom. The reaction was a violent storm of controversy and hope. To the enslaved millions, it was the first true light in a centuries-long night. To the South, it was an act of monstrous tyranny that justified a fight to the death. In the North, it fractured political parties and led to riots, yet it also galvanized the moral core of the nation. Lincoln stood in the center of this hurricane, his tall silhouette a lighthouse of indigo calm amidst the swirling chaos. He knew that by this act, he had signed his own death warrant in the eyes of many, yet he also knew that he had finally aligned the cause of the Union with the cause of humanity. The silence of the Maryland fields was now filled with the echoes of a new promise. The rail splitter had used his authority to break the ultimate chains, knowing that the blood spilled at Antietam had become the ink with which the future of freedom would be written. The transition from a war for territory to a war for the human soul was now complete. April 1865 arrived in Washington not with the triumphant roar of victory, but with the profound, resonant silence that follows a great and terrible storm. The Civil War, the bloody crucible that had forged a new nation from the ashes of the old, was staggering to its agonizing close. Richmond had fallen, and Robert E. Lee's once mighty army of Northern Virginia was a pale, starving shadow of its former self, surrounded and awaiting its final dissolution at Appomattox. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had steered the ship of state through this tempest of fire and blood, walked the halls of the White House like a spectral figure. His face was a living map of the nation's suffering, deeply lined, his eyes sunken into hollows of fatigue, his entire frame stooped as if carrying the physical weight of every casualty. He was 56 years old, but he looked 20 years older, a living testament to the colossal burden of his office. He had achieved what many deemed impossible. He had preserved the Union and broken the shackles of millions. Yet he stood on the threshold of peace not with exultation, but with a deeply settled melancholia that seemed to seep from his very pores. The black dog of depression, his lifelong companion, had returned with renewed ferocity in these final days. His nights were plagued by strange, vivid dreams that left him shaken and contemplative. In the early days of April, just before Lee's surrender, he confided one such dream to his wife Mary and a few close friends, a premonition that would soon become a terrifying part of his legend. He described finding himself in a death-like stillness, drifting through the White House until he heard the sound of subdued sobbing. He followed the sound to the East Room, where he saw a catafalque draped in black, surrounded by a guard of soldiers and a crowd of weeping mourners. "Who is dead in the White House?" He asked one of the soldiers in the dream. "The president," was the answer. "He was killed by an assassin." This dream was not merely a product of his exhausted mind. It was a reflection of the inescapable reality that he was a marked man. He had received thousands of death threats throughout the war, each one a reminder that the hatred he had stirred in the hearts of many would not end with the laying down of arms. Lincoln seemed to accept this fate with a stoic calm. He had once remarked that if someone was determined to kill him, they would find a way, and he refused to live his life in a cage of fear. He walked the streets of Washington with minimal guard, visited the troops at the front, and famously entered the captured Confederate capital of Richmond, walking among the newly freed slaves who hailed him as a messiah. Yet, this calmness was underpinned by a profound sadness, a sense that his role in the great drama was drawing to a close. He had led his people through the wilderness, but like Moses, he suspected he would not be permitted to enter the promised land of a reconstructed and healed America. The days leading up to that fateful Good Friday were filled with the business of winding down the war, cabinet meetings, plans for reconstruction, and the joyful news of Lee's surrender on Palm Sunday. But the shadow of the East Room dream never truly lifted. It was a silent presence in every conversation, a whisper in every moment of solitude. The indigo twilight of his presidency was upon him, a final, quiet hour before the curtain fell. The rail splitter, who had become the great emancipator, was now preparing for his final role, the martyred savior of a reborn republic. The morning of Good Friday, April 14, 1865, dawned with a rare and radiant clarity over the city of Washington, as if the heavens themselves were offering a moment of respite after 4 years of relentless storm. For Abraham Lincoln, the day began with a lightness of spirit he had not felt since the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. At breakfast with his family, he spoke of the future with a quiet optimism, discussing travel and a return to the simple life of a Prairie lawyer once his second term was complete. The war was over, the Union was preserved, and for a brief, flickering moment, the heavy mantle of sorrow seemed to lift from his stooped shoulders. He spent the afternoon on a carriage ride with Mary, their conversation filled with a renewed affection and a shared sense of relief. He told her that he had never felt so happy in his life, a statement that would soon echo with a haunting and terrible irony through the corridors of history. As the indigo shadows of evening stretched across the Capitol, the president and his party made their way to Ford's Theater to see a performance of the popular comedy, Our American Cousin. The theater was a sea of light and laughter, a place of temporary escape for a weary people who had forgotten how to celebrate. Lincoln sat in the presidential box, draped in flags and lace, his tall silhouette visible to the adoring crowd below who cheered his entrance with a fervor that bordered on religious devotion. He leaned back in his rocking chair, a faint smile playing across his deeply lined face as he watched the antics on the stage. Yet, hidden in the shadows of the theater's narrow corridors and backstage areas, a different kind of drama was unfolding. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and a man consumed by a toxic and fanatical devotion to the lost cause of the Confederacy, was moving with the silent grace of a predator toward the presidential box. He knew every inch of the theater, he knew the timing of the play, and he knew that the single guard at the door had stepped away for a moment of refreshment. The moment of the attack was timed with a chilling precision to coincide with a burst of loud laughter from the audience. Booth slipped into the box unnoticed, the darkness swallowing his figure as he drew a single-shot derringer from his pocket. The flash of the muzzle was a sudden, violent tear in the fabric of the evening, followed by a sharp report that many in the audience mistook for part of the play. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear, ending his consciousness in an instant and plunging the leader of the nation into a final, impenetrable silence. As Mary's scream pierced the sudden hush, Booth leaped from the box to the stage below, his spur catching on the Treasury flag and causing him to land awkwardly, breaking his leg. He stood for a fleeting moment, brandishing a dagger and shouting the motto of Virginia, Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Before the stunned crowd could fully comprehend what had happened, he vanished into the night, leaving behind a theater filled with chaos and a nation whose heart had just been pierced. The transition from comedy to catastrophe was instantaneous and absolute. The theater was cleared of its revelers, replaced by soldiers, doctors, and weeping citizens who watched as the unconscious president was carried across the street to a modest boarding house owned by William Petersen. The silence that fell over Washington that night was unlike any other. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of shock and disbelief. The light in the presidential box was extinguished, but the shadow cast by that single shot was destined to stretch across the centuries. Lincoln was no longer the leader of a faction or the commander of an army. He was a fallen martyr, his life blood ebbing away in a small room while the nation held its collective breath in the dark. The rail splitter had reached the end of his long, muddy road, and the final curtain was descending on a life that had redefined the very soul of America. Across the muddy expanse of 10th Street, under a sky that had turned from a celebratory spring evening into a weeping, indigo shroud of rain, the unconscious form of Abraham Lincoln was carried into the modest boarding house of William Petersen. The transition was jarring and surreal. The leader of a nation, the man who had just dismantled the institution of slavery and preserved the Union, now lay diagonally across a bed that was too small for his towering frame in a cramped, dimly lit back room. This humble setting became the unexpected sanctum for one of the most profound vigils in human history. As the news of the tragedy rippled through the dark streets of Washington, the house began to fill with the silent figures of his cabinet members, generals, and oldest friends. They stood in the shadows of the flickering gaslights, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief, fury, and a soul-crushing sorrow that no words could adequately convey. The rhythmic, labored breathing of the dying president was the only sound that filled the heavy silence of the room, a slow, agonizing countdown that marked the final ebbing of a titanic life. Throughout that long, agonizing night, the room became a crossroads of history and personal tragedy. Doctors worked in hushed whispers, knowing that the bullet's path had rendered their skills useless, while Edwin Stanton, the stern Secretary of War, took command of the government from a small desk in the adjoining room, his usual iron resolve tempered by the visible shaking of his hands. Outside the window, the city of Washington was transformed into a ghost town of mourning. Thousands of citizens, black and white, stood in the drenching rain, their faces turned toward the Petersen house in a collective prayer that transcended political or racial lines. They waited for a miracle that would not come, their silence a testament to the profound bond Lincoln had forged with the common people. Inside, Mary Todd Lincoln's grief was so explosive and overwhelming that she had to be led away from the bedside periodically, leaving the silent vigil to the men who had shared the burden of the war with him. The indigo alacacaranligi of the room seemed to deepen with every passing hour, as if the very air was thickening with the gravity of the moment. As the first gray light of dawn began to touch the rooftops of Washington on April 15, 1865, the labored breathing finally slowed to a faint, ghostly flutter. At 7:22 in the morning, the heart that had carried the sorrows of an entire nation finally found its peace. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the small room, a stillness so heavy it felt as if time itself had stopped to pay its respects. The doctor placed his hand over Lincoln's heart and whispered, "He is gone." In that moment, the rail splitter from Illinois passed from the realm of living men into the immortal halls of history. Edwin Stanton, his voice thick with emotion, broke the silence with words that would resonate through the centuries. Now he belongs to the ages. It was the final benediction for a man who had become the sacrificial lamb of the Republic. The long night was over, but the world that woke up that morning was fundamentally changed. The architect of the new birth of freedom was dead, but the spirit he had breathed into the nation was destined to live on. An eternal flame ignited in the darkness of a small boarding house room. The body of Abraham Lincoln, embalmed and dressed in the same suit he wore at his second inauguration, began its final, mournful odyssey on April 21, 1865, a journey that would trace the reverse path of his hopeful arrival in Washington 4 years earlier. A special funeral train, draped in black crepe and silver fringe, was commissioned to carry the fallen president back to the Illinois Prairie that he had always considered home. The engine, named the Nashville, was polished to a somber gleam, its bell tolling with a slow, mournful rhythm that became the heartbeat of a grieving nation. Behind it pulled 9 cars, including the presidential car that had been intended for happier travels, now converted into a moving sanctuary for the dead. Inside, the coffin rested on a catafalque, guarded day and night by a rotating honor guard of Union soldiers, their brass buttons and bayonets glinting softly in the dim lamplight. For 17 days and nearly 1,700 miles, the Lincoln funeral train wound its way through the heart of a country that was still bleeding from the wounds of war. It was the largest funeral procession in human history, a solemn pageant of grief that touched the lives of millions. In major cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, the coffin was removed from the train and placed in state in grand public buildings, where tens of thousands of citizens waited in lines that stretched for miles, braving rain and cold just to catch a fleeting glimpse of the face that had become the symbol of their sacrifice. The silence in these vast halls was broken only by the shuffling of feet and the muffled sounds of sobbing. But the true power of the procession was felt in the small towns and rural crossroads. As the train passed in the deep indigo twilight or the dead of night, thousands of people gathered alongside the tracks, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of bonfires and torches. They stood in reverent silence, men removing their hats, women weeping openly, and former slaves holding up their children to see the passing of the great emancipator. The mournful wail of the train's whistle became a universal language of sorrow, echoing across the fields and forests of a reborn nation. The journey was a pilgrimage of a people to the shrine of their martyr. It was a collective catharsis, a way for a nation that had lost so much to say a final goodbye to the man who had borne their burdens. On May 3, the train finally arrived in Springfield, Illinois, where Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, under the wide skies of the prairie he had loved. The long, strange trip from the log cabin in Kentucky to the highest office in the land was over. The rail splitter had returned to the earth from which he came, but the legacy he left behind was forged in a fire that could never be extinguished. The tracks of the funeral train soon faded, but the path he had cleared for freedom remained, a road map for the unfinished work that lay ahead for the American people. In the days following the departure of the funeral train, a profound and heavy silence settled over the executive mansion, a silence that seemed to have its own weight and texture, as if the very air was mourning the absence of the tall, gaunt man who had paced its hallways through 1,000 sleepless nights. The office where he had signed the Emancipation Proclamation and wrestled with the ghosts of fallen soldiers was now a hollow sanctuary, his worn wooden desk covered in a thin veil of dust, and the unanswered letters of a nation that still reached out to him in desperate hope. The empty chair at the head of the cabinet table stood as a stark, indigo-shadowed reminder of the void that had been torn in the fabric of the Republic. Abraham Lincoln was no longer a man of flesh and blood, prone to doubt and weary of the relentless political storms. He was beginning his final transformation into the central myth of the American experience. The rail splitter and the great emancipator were being fused into a singular, immortal figure, a secular saint who had offered his own life as the final sacrifice to atone for the nation's original sin. This process of myth-making was not an intentional construction of spin doctors or historians, but a spontaneous and overwhelming surge of collective grief and reverence that swept across the continent. The millions who had criticized him for his slow pace, his cautious diplomacy, or his perceived awkwardness now saw only the towering moral clarity of his achievements. In the cabins of the South and the tenements of the North, his portrait began to appear on walls alongside religious icons, a silent guardian of the freedom he had died to secure. The stories of his humble origins, the log cabin, the reading by firelight, the splitting of rails, were retold with a liturgical fervor, turning the details of a difficult life into the parables of a new national faith. He became the embodiment of the American dream in its most tragic and noble form, the proof that from the lowliest soil could grow a soul capable of saving a civilization. The deep indigo twilight of his memory was not a fading light, but a steady, glowing ember that provided warmth to a people still shivering from the cold reality of the war's aftermath. As the nation began the agonizingly slow work of reconstruction, the spirit of Lincoln remained an invisible but omnipresent guide. His words from the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural were quoted like scripture, serving as the moral compass for a society trying to navigate the treacherous waters of peace without its captain. He was no longer a politician to be debated, but a standard to be reached for. The empty chair in Washington symbolized not just a loss of leadership, but the immense responsibility he had left behind for those who remained. He had cleared the path and broken the chains, but the unfinished work he had spoken of was now the inheritance of every citizen. In the quiet of the Illinois night and the bustling streets of the capital, the legend of Lincoln grew larger than the man ever was, a silhouette of indigo calm that stood watch over the republic he had died to preserve. He had passed into the realm of the eternal, where the better angels of our nature would forever find their voice in his memory. As the decades drifted past the site of the great conflict, the physical landscape of Washington, D.C. began to transform, seeking a permanent home for the spirit of the man who had held the nation together during its darkest hour. The decision to build a monumental tribute to Abraham Lincoln was not merely an architectural project. It was a collective effort to solidify a legacy that had become the very foundation of the modern republic. On the edge of the Potomac River, where the land was once a swampy marshland reminiscent of the difficult terrain Lincoln had navigated in life, a temple of white Georgia marble began to rise toward the heavens. This was not to be a common tomb or a simple statue, but a sanctuary of memory, a Greek Doric temple that symbolized the enduring strength and classical ideals of the democracy he had died to preserve. The construction took years of meticulous labor, each block of stone carefully placed to create a structure that felt both ancient and eternal, a place where the silence of the past could speak to the uncertainties of the future. In the center of this majestic hall, the sculptor Daniel Chester French labored to bring the image of the great emancipator back to life in 19 feet of glistening marble. The result was a seated figure of Lincoln that transcended mere representation. It was an icon of concentrated power and profound indigo-shadowed sorrow. He sits in a chair of state, his large, weathered hands resting on the arms, one clenched in a firm grip of resolve, the other relaxed in a gesture of paternal compassion. His face, illuminated by the soft, indirect light that filters through the columns, is a masterpiece of psychological depth. The lines of care and the sunken eyes that characterized his final years are preserved in stone, inviting every visitor to look into the soul of a man who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. The statue does not depict a conqueror in a moment of triumph, but a weary leader in a moment of deep, eternal reflection. The atmosphere inside the memorial is one of hushed reverence, where the echoes of footsteps on the stone floors are the only intrusion into a silence that feels sacred. Carved into the walls on either side of the seated figure are the words that defined his mission and the nation's destiny, the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address. These are not just inscriptions. They are the liturgical texts of the American experiment, reminding every soul who enters the temple of the new birth of freedom and the necessity of malice toward none and charity for all. As the indigo twilight descends over the National Mall, the white marble of the memorial glows with an ethereal light, reflecting in the long pool that stretches toward the Washington Monument. In this space, Lincoln is no longer a historical figure subject to the whims of political debate. He is the silent guardian of the Republic's conscience. The rail splitter has been enshrined in a temple that belongs to the world, his image becoming a beacon of hope for the oppressed and a reminder of the terrible cost of liberty. The empty chair in the White House has been replaced by this eternal throne of memory, ensuring that as long as these stones stand, the voice of Abraham Lincoln will continue to whisper its message of unity and human dignity across the centuries. As the centuries have turned, and the America that Abraham Lincoln saved has grown into a global power whose influence stretches far beyond the humble prairie where he once split rails, his shadow has not diminished, but has rather elongated across the landscape of the human consciousness. The mystic chords of memory he invoked in his first inaugural address have not fallen silent. They have become the enduring soundtrack of the nation's ongoing struggle to live up to its own ideals. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. is no longer just a tribute in stone. It has become a living temple of American democracy, a sacred space where history is not just remembered, but actively made. It was on those very steps, under the stony gaze of the seated emancipator, that Martin Luther King Jr. articulated the dream that was the direct spiritual descendant of the Gettysburg Address, proving that the unfinished work Lincoln spoke of was a baton that had been passed across the generations. In the quiet indigo twilight, when the tourists have mostly departed and the National Mall is left to the whispering winds of the Potomac, the true power of Lincoln's legacy can be felt most profoundly. His presence is not confined to the marble figure or the words carved into the walls. It is dissolved into the very air of the Republic. He is the silent guest at every political debate that weighs the cost of freedom, the unseen conscience in every courtroom where justice is sought for the marginalized, and the enduring symbol of hope for every person in the world who looks to America as a beacon of liberty. The man of sorrows, who bore the weight of a civil war on his stooped shoulders, has become the eternal flame that illuminates the path forward, a reminder that the price of a more perfect union is constant vigilance and a willingness to confront the darkest aspects of the national soul. The legend of the rail splitter is no longer a simple story of rustic ambition. It is a foundational myth that speaks to the limitless potential of the human spirit to rise above its circumstances and change the course of history. His journey from a dirt floor cabin to the highest office in the land is the ultimate validation of the American promise, Yet his tragic death is the somber reminder of how fragile that promise can be. As long as the Republic stands, the dialogue with Lincoln will never truly end. He is the measure against which all leaders are judged, the moral compass that stubbornly points toward the true north of human dignity. In the final analysis, Abraham Lincoln is not a figure trapped in the amber of the past. He is a contemporary presence, a towering indigo-shadowed guide who walks ahead of the nation, forever challenging it to be better, to be braver, and to be true to the revolutionary idea that all men are created equal. The fire he lit in the darkness of the 19th century still burns, and it is up to each new generation to ensure that it is never extinguished. While the American soil slowly healed over the scars of the great conflict, the name of Abraham Lincoln began to drift far beyond the borders of the Republic, carried on the winds of change to the most distant corners of the globe. He was no longer merely the president of a reunited United States. He was becoming a universal archetype of the human struggle for dignity and justice. In the cramped tenements of London, the peasant huts of Russia, and the revolutionary cells of Europe, the story of the rail splitter who broke the chains of millions was told as a modern-day parable. To those who lived under the crushing weight of ancient monarchies and rigid class systems, Lincoln was the living proof that a new world was possible, a world where the circumstances of one's birth did not dictate the destination of one's soul. His image, often rendered in simple woodcuts or lithographs, began to appear in the homes of the poor across the world, a silent, indigo-shadowed guardian of hope in the darkness of oppression. The reach of his influence was perhaps most poignantly felt in the vast expanses of the Russian Empire. When the news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached the ears of the Russian serfs, who were themselves navigating the treacherous waters of their own recent liberation, Lincoln was hailed as a brother in spirit. The great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy would later recount a story of traveling in the Caucasus and meeting a local chieftain who had never heard of the great conquerors of history, but was obsessed with the story of the giant from the West, who spoke for the common man. Tolstoy himself described Lincoln as a Christ in miniature, a figure who had achieved greatness not through the brutal force of arms, but through the quiet, unyielding power of a moral idea. This global recognition was not the result of calculated propaganda, but the organic recognition of a shared human aspiration. Lincoln had articulated truths that were not merely American, but universal. He had spoken to the better angels of the entire human race. Across the Atlantic, in the industrial heartlands of Great Britain, the working classes felt a profound and personal connection to the man from the prairie. During the darkest days of the war, when the cotton famine caused by the Union blockade brought thousands of British textile workers to the brink of starvation, they refused to support the Confederacy. They saw in Lincoln a champion of their own dignity, recognizing that the cause of the American slave was inseparable from the cause of the free laborer everywhere. Lincoln responded to their sacrifice with letters of profound gratitude, forging a bond of transatlantic solidarity that would endure long after his death. Today, statues of Lincoln stand in London, Mexico City, and Oslo, not as relics of a foreign leader, but as monuments to a shared heritage of liberty. He has become a citizen of the world, a figure whose indigo-tinted legacy provides a steady light for every nation that struggles to find its own new birth of freedom. The silence of the prairie where he began his journey has been replaced by a global chorus of reverence. From the mountains of South Africa to the squares of Prague, the words of the Gettysburg Address have been translated into 1,000 languages, each one a testament to the enduring power of his logic and the depth of his empathy. Lincoln is the reminder that the struggle for human rights is a single, unbroken chain that connects all of humanity across the centuries. He is the indigo shadow that walks beside the oppressed in every generation, a silent reminder that the path to justice is long and often paved with sorrow, but that it ultimately leads toward the light. The rail splitter from Illinois has become the architect of a global conscience, ensuring that as long as there are chains to be broken, his voice will continue to whisper its message of hope across the vast and restless oceans of time. Beyond the strategic maps of the War Department and the thunderous oratory of the political stage lay a territory far more mysterious and untamed: the inner landscape of Abraham Lincoln's mind. To understand the leader who preserved the Union, one must first understand the man who lived in a state of perpetual struggle with his own shadows. Throughout his life, Lincoln was haunted by a profound and clinical melancholy, a black dog that followed him from the dirt floors of Kentucky to the gilded halls of the White House. This was not merely a passing sadness, but a geological feature of his soul, an indigo-tinted gloom that sharpened his empathy even as it threatened to drown his spirit. In the 19th century, this condition was often dismissed as hypochondria, but for Lincoln, it was a crucible. It was through the long, lonely nights of wrestling with despair that he forged the iron resolve and the bottomless compassion that would later define his presidency. He understood suffering not as an abstract concept, but as a daily companion, and it was this intimate acquaintance with pain that allowed him to carry the collective grief of a fracturing nation without breaking. His psychological depth was inextricably linked to a shifting and deeply personal spirituality. Lincoln was never a man of dogmatic religion. He belonged to no specific church and often expressed doubts about the rigid orthodoxies of his time. Yet, as the war progressed and the death tolls reached astronomical heights, his language became increasingly biblical and his perspective increasingly providential. He began to see himself not as the master of his own fate, but as a humble instrument in the hands of a higher power, whose designs were vast and often inscrutable. He famously remarked that he had been driven many times to his knees by the overwhelming conviction that he had nowhere else to go. This spiritual evolution was not a retreat into superstition, but a profound recognition of human limitation. The indigo twilight of his office became a place of secular prayer, where the heavy silence was filled with the realization that the war was a divine retribution for the national sin of slavery, a debt that had to be paid in blood. This mystical fatalism gave him the strength to endure the unendurable, providing a moral anchor in a sea of chaotic violence. The mysticism that surrounded him was most visible in his relationship with the unseen world. Lincoln was a man of the frontier, raised on stories of omens, portents, and dreams. He took his dreams seriously, seeing them not as mere figments of imagination, but as whispers from a deeper reality. Whether it was the recurring dream of a ship moving toward a dark and indefinite shore before a great battle, or the chilling premonition of his own death in the East Room, these internal visions provided a haunting backdrop to his external actions. He lived on the threshold between the rational world of the law and the mysterious world of the spirit, a bridge between the enlightenment of the mind and the ancient wisdom of the heart. This duality made him a singular figure in American history, a leader who could calculate military logistics with a cold eye while simultaneously reciting Shakespeare to the shadows of the White House. He was a man of the people who remained fundamentally unknowable, a silhouette of indigo calm whose true depths were hidden behind a mask of folksy humor and weary patience. As we approach the final conclusion of his story, we find that the rail splitter was in fact a master weaver of the human spirit. He took the frayed and bloody threads of a divided people and bound them together with the cords of his own suffering. His legacy is not just found in the laws he passed or the battles he won. but in the very quality of his character, a character tempered in the fire of personal tragedy and national catastrophe. He remains the man of sorrows for all time, a leader who demonstrated that greatness is not found in the absence of fear or the avoidance of pain, but in the ability to transform that pain into a force for justice. The indigo light that bathes his memory is the light of a soul that burned brightly in the dark, a flame that was nourished by the very shadows it sought to dispel. Abraham Lincoln's internal journey was the true front line of the Civil War, and it was in the silent chambers of his heart that the ultimate victory for the human soul was achieved. The long, arduous journey of the rail splitter from the mud-chinked cabin of Kentucky to the immortal heights of human history has finally reached its ultimate horizon, leaving behind a world that is fundamentally different from the one he entered. As the final curtain falls on the 19th century and the indigo shadows of time begin to soften the jagged edges of the great conflict, Abraham Lincoln remains more than a memory. He is a permanent star in the constellation of human conscience. He was the man who held the light when the darkness threatened to consume the very idea of freedom, the leader who understood that a house divided against itself could not stand, and the martyr whose blood became the seal on a new covenant of liberty. His story is the great American epic, a tragedy that ends in triumph, a humble beginning that leads to a sovereign sacrifice. The silence of the prairie where he once walked is now filled with the echoes of his words, words that have become the liturgy of every soul that yearns for dignity. The transformation of Abraham Lincoln from a man of flesh and blood into an eternal symbol is now complete. He is no longer subject to the fatigue of the body or the stings of political malice. He has passed into the realm of the absolute. When we look back across the vast, indigo-tinted expanse of the years, we see a figure who embodied the best and worst of the human condition, the capacity for profound sorrow, and the ability to find humor in the midst of despair, the weight of immense power and the humility of a servant. He proved that a nation's strength is not found in the sharpness of its swords or the vastness of its wealth, but in the quality of its character and its commitment to the better angels of our nature. The empty chair in the White House and the silent halls of the Petersen house are now monuments not to a loss, but to a legacy that continues to breathe life into the pursuit of justice. Lincoln is the reminder that the work of freedom is never finished, but must be renewed by every generation with the same firmness in the right that he displayed. As the twilight deepens over the modern world, the silhouette of the tall, gaunt man with the stovepipe hat still stands watch over the republic he died to preserve. He is the indigo-shadowed guide who walks beside us in our own moments of national and personal crisis, whispering the timeless truths of unity, charity, and human equality. The rail splitter has finished his work, yet his influence remains a restless, vibrant force, a flame that burns brightly in the hearts of the oppressed, and a compass for those who seek to lead with a conscience. The story of Abraham Lincoln is the story of humanity's potential to rise above its own darkness and reach for the light. He was the sunset of the old world of chains and the morning star of a new world of freedom. And as we close this final chapter, we realize that while the man belongs to the ages, his spirit remains here with us, an eternal presence in the quiet moments of reflection and the loud cries for justice. The journey is complete, but the horizon he opened remains wide, infinite, and forever indigo.